It's wonderful to be here. I appreciate the invitation to be here today to talk about something that's very important to me, and I think to the global community as we think about the world condition currently. Uh, the idea or the concept of inclusive education is important. Why? Because of the inequities and disparities that exist in the world today. And inclusive education really is a strategy to address some of those inequities in education. We know that education is the basis for development and growth and in the improvement of the human condition, but also society in terms of advancements that are made. So I'm going to be sharing with you some thoughts about my experiences that I've had living in the United States and working in the United States at the University of Arizona in the area of special education, but also many years that I've been working in Mexico. My first degree is from the University of the Americas in Puebla, Mexico, where I studied for 2 years. And then I also did my dissertation research in Mexico City in private and public schools. So those are very formative experiences that I had, as well as my work over the years with colleagues in Mexico. And my transition kind of went from being the director of a bilingual special education program at the University of Arizona, where I coordinated and directed those programs in preparing teachers to work with kids who are bilingual, primarily Spanish-English, working with them in addressing their special needs in schools. So I've had experience preparing teachers in the United States and have a sense of what special education is in the United States versus what special education is in Mexico. But I've also done significant research in Chile, up and down the country of Chile. I did quite a bit of research there. In Ecuador, worked in Argentina, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, with a good friend of mine there. So I do have quite a bit of experience in Latin America. I lived in Nicaragua for 3 years during the Sandinista Revolution. That kind of dates me. But it's important because it provides a context. We say, well, who's this guy? Why is he talking about inclusive education? What kind of background and experience does he have to share? And so I do have a bit of experience in Latin America. And I think it's important in the context of inclusive education. We have these constructs of the global north. Have you heard about this? Or the global south. You're probably familiar with these terms. And what we're going to see, or what we see in inclusive education, is most of the advances and most of the way things originated in inclusive education have originated in the global north. And so what's happening is that these policies and practices and initiatives come from that perspective. So that can be good and bad, has its advantages and disadvantages, because there's quite a bit of difference between countries who supposedly are in the global north and those that are in the global south in terms of advantages of education, maybe economic, social development that is disparate from what we see in Latin America. So in that sense, I think that's important to have a context, because someone once said, text without context is pretext. I don't know if you understand that. You can think about it and ponder on that, but context matters, and providing you a context of who I am and my experiences, I think, is important. So let me just start here and move to the first slide, because it's important to understand inclusive education in the context of the world and children that are not in school. What are the statistics regarding, kids in school or kids not being in school? And we can see here that actually about 17% of children currently that was as of 2018, were excluded from schools. So what are we talking about? Somewhere around 250 million children are not in school. That's not counting the kids that enter school and abandon school either. So we have a real crisis, and I think that's why inclusive education is a strategy. It's a global strategy that, as you know, is being promoted by the United Nations, by UNESCO, and all of the initiatives, all the things, all the agreements, all those convenios que se han firmado have to do and come from that particular epicenter, which is the United Nations and UNESCO. So what we're going to see, I'm going to show you briefly a lot of these agreements that have been made. You're probably familiar with them. Starting in 1990 with the Education for All conference in Jomtien, Thailand, where they started this whole idea about how can we better educate children in the world? What can we do as a global community and the countries that are represented by that to provide guidance and information about interventions, not only in the way of practices, but primarily more in policies, which drive practices. Policies are what? Our policies are basically statements about what our practices are going to look like. Policies say, this is our feeling, this is our belief about education, and this is what we're going to do about it. And so I guess we can see that with inclusive education, there are some key words that I think are important to think about. A number of them. One is disruption. One is realignment. One is transformation. Another is tension. There are tensions, and the other is resistance. Those are just some words that come to mind when I think about inclusive education and what's going on a global scale, and what's been going on now for since 1990. It's almost 30 years, going on 40 years, that we've had a lot of these initiatives and policies and agreements in place, which are having an impact in Colombia, in the United States, in Mexico, in Asia, in Africa. And so I think that's a good thing. I'm very much an internationalist. I believe in the United Nations, UNESCO, and the policies that they promote, because they express a concern about children and about education on a global level, at least in this particular dimension that we're talking about today. So I'm very much a supporter of what they're doing and what they're trying to do to coordinate policy or policies, provide guidance so that nations like Colombia, which has adopted, I think, the Education for All policy, and a number of other policies that have come from that. Mexico is also a country that's adopted. I must say, as I'm going to show you, the United States is not necessarily a country or a nation that's adopted all of the policies and initiatives coming out of the United Nations. We have our own history about special education, and we have our own laws about special education, which are different from those being promoted oftentimes by the concept of inclusive education. Inclusive education is not a law in the United States. It's not really even a policy. It's really more of a movement. The movement of providing education to students in the least restrictive environment, which is a term that we use in our law in the United States. That means trying to educate a student in the environment most close to the general education setting. We want to keep kids, to the degree possible, working with other children of the same age, the same grade. But we also have other, practices, policies that we use in terms of that. So again, inclusive education on a global scale, there's a great need for it. We have the statistics. We don't have to go into much more. Okay? So again, inclusivity, equity, how does inclusive education do that? Okay? One of the things we look at is changing policies because too many kids have been excluded. And you will see in what dimensions they've been excluded. I would say inclusive education, the core of inclusive education is about disability. But it's not the only thing about inclusion. Inclusion is much broader than that. We know that there's a lot of many other populations that have been marginalized and excluded that also need to be in the conversation and need to be included in our work in inclusive education to ensure that they're also getting what they need in terms of special educational needs. That's a concept that came after we had Education for All in 1990. In 1994, what did we have? We had another big meeting, international meeting in Salamanca, Spain. And out of that came a statement about, which provided sort of what would you say, a blueprint for thinking about serving kids with disabilities. And out of that 1994 meeting came this concept of special educational needs, which meant what? It meant, okay, disabilities, but you have gender, you have ethnicity, you have languages, you have women, you have poverty, I mean, a lot of things. And so that's important to understand the context of what we've seen over the years. So this is something I found just today, actually, from the World Health Organization about this last thing that says, civil societies and governments need to recognize talents that are equally distributed between rich and poor in all cultures, nationalities, and disabilities. So it's equally distributed, these kinds of things. It's not like, well, the global north, these people, oh, they have an advantage, they're cognitively more capable, et cetera, et cetera. No way. Remember, it's oftentimes about opportunity to develop and to have an education. And that's what we're talking about here in terms of inclusive education. So that's important to keep in mind. Let me see here as I'm going to. Okay, so if we think about inclusive education, there's a justification that was discussed. In fact, it was discussed here in Cali, Colombia in 2019. Did any of you attend that conference? It was from September 11th to September 13th in 2019. They kind of developed a discussion paper, and the meeting took place here in Cali, Colombia. So you have a part in the history of inclusive education and what's occurring currently. And out of that meeting, they came up with these three, what is the justification for inclusive education? Is it just a good idea? We're going to put everybody in the same classroom and no, there's justifications here which are outlined. There's an educational justification. How do we respond to meet the needs of all kids, to be able to teach all kids and respond to individual differences? Because that's a reality. There's a social justification, which is what? How do we change attitudes about difference? How do we change attitudes of not only teachers, but also the general population? And then there's also the thing of the economic justification. Because whether you like it or not, and the United States has a very sophisticated special education system that's very expensive. You could never put that model here in Colombia. You can't put it in Mexico. We have the fortune, the United States, I don't live in the United States, I live in Mexico now, but those that live in the United States and their children who have disabilities, we have quite a sophisticated system of providing for the individual differences of kids. But it's costly. What they're suggesting here, the economical justification for inclusive education, is that it's less costly. And somehow we can provide for the needs of kids by integrating them or including them into schools with other kids. So we don't talk about segregation or exclusion, but we talk about including and developing inclusive schools. Okay, which is important. This is something from the Assistant Director of UNESCO in their statement here, which I think is very powerful. It said, she said, excuse me, if we fail to invest in education today, we are setting the world on a course of more exclusion, inequality, and polarization. We cannot procrastinate. We must save our future. In other words, it's a crisis. We have to take action, and I think all the mandates and the initiatives and the agreements of inclusive education put forth by the United Nations, UNESCO, they have a sense of urgency. And so we should have a sense of urgency in terms of also what each particular community or country is doing as well. So I think it's dire. There's a lot of things here. Now, if I were to ask you, what is your definition of inclusive education? There are many, and inclusive education is a very complex subject, depending upon the country you're in, depending on maybe on a particular community. So we can give generalizations, and I can give you many definitions. I've provided one here that gives us a sense of maybe what it might mean, but it's also very controversial in some places, okay? What does it say there? It's a process that involves transformation. Remember I talked about keywords? I talked about what? Realignment. I talked about transformation. I talked about disruption. I talked about tension. And I talked about resistance. Inclusive education embodies all of those words and creates, tension and creates all these things. Because really, what we're suggesting is the current system is dysfunctional. It doesn't work. It doesn't meet the needs of all of our kids. And so what do we have to do? Well, you want to maintain the status quo? Do you understand what I mean by status quo? Well, we're just going to leave it like it is. That's just the way it's going to be. Some kids are going to be excluded. They're going to be marginalized. They're not going to be able to participate. Or we're going to say, no, every child matters. Does every child matter? Yes. In my opinion, every child matters. And so what does that mean? Well, it means if something's not working, do we just continue? And that is the definition of insanity, which Albert Einstein actually talked about. What does it mean? It means you just do the same thing over and over again, and you have the same result. It's not funny, because that's what's been happening a lot. But what we're seeing now with this whole realignment with inclusive education, things are happening. Okay, there's a lot going on, and for the better, because more kids are now in school, more kids are being included, more kids are participating. But again, we look at the different characters in this process: kids with HIV and AIDS, linguistic minorities, kids in rural populations, women who are oftentimes excluded, ethnic diversity, etc., and disabilities as well. So anyway, this is really an important thing. So inclusive education is all about social justice, isn't it? Providing kids opportunities for education. We know that education is the way to improve your position in society. Once you become educated, you get a degree, you graduate high school, you do whatever. We know that the data suggests, is very clear, that you have a better opportunity to find a good job, you make more money, etc. Also, it leads to less crime in our society. What's going on in our societies? Hay mucha gente desesperada with what's going on with the crime and violence and all this stuff. It's a lack of education. People need to be educated. To the degree of an educated population, you're going to have a safer community, the society that you're living in. So this is beneficial for all of us. This has plus valía para todos nosotros. No? It definitely does. So we have to think about it that way. There's no better investment in our society than education. Okay? So what he's talking about here is that we know that it leads, the social justice agenda can lead to better access and participation and learning, which are really very, very positive outcomes in terms of our goals. What are some of the agreements? There's a long history here in our world about things that UNESCO has been promoting for many years. And it started back, the 60s, and then moves along to the United States. We had something significant happen in 1975 in our particular laws. But we can see that this is a process. This just didn't start yesterday. So that's why I'm saying there's a lot of resistance that we've seen, and that has not led to where probably the advances and progress where we should be. But that's just the reality of things. Okay. I talked about Jomtien, Thailand. I talked about Salamanca. Then there were successive UNESCO conferences in Amman, Jordan, Dakar in Africa, Geneva, Switzerland, and Incheon in South Korea. So what happened? There's this impetus, there's this momentum to get something done. And so, it's been happening. And there's lots that's been done to promote these kinds of practices, okay? And there are goals and commitments. All of you are familiar with what? The United Nations Sustainability Goals for 2030. You're all familiar with that? I think people are much more familiar with that here in Latin America and other countries than the United States. Why? Because we don't adhere to the United Nations in terms of what they're telling us to do, because we think we know how to do what to do with kids with disabilities or with the kids of special educational needs. And so we don't necessarily adhere to that. But still, look at all things that have been going on with regards to trying and making the effort to make a difference in kids' lives. And so it's very admirable what we see what's gone on. Okay, how many of you have heard of the? I'm trying to think of the word in Spanish, but it's the United Nations General Assembly comes up with the Conventions for Rights of Disabled Persons. This is something that was brought up in 2006. It was ratified by many countries in 2008 and in 2014. The U.S. didn't support that. There's only 2 countries in the world that don't support the CRPD. Who is it? Somalia, que vergüenza, and the United States. Why? There's reasons why. Because one is the U.S. believes in its policies and doesn't want somebody telling us what we should do with particular population. So that's kind of a cowboy mentality, if you know what I mean. Okay. But then Somalia, that's the only other country. That's shameful. That's why I say es una vergüenza, really, to see that we're coupled with Somalia in terms of not thinking this is important. But again, we have our reasons, and I told you what they are. But at the same time, we in the United States don't believe in the concept of full inclusion. Have you ever heard of the concept full inclusion? What does that mean? That means all kids are going to be in the general education classroom. We're not going to provide them any other services. We're going to prepare general ed teachers and special education teachers to work in the general education classroom and address all the needs of kids with disabilities. Is that possible? In my point of view, no. But that's what this convention basically says, is that to the degree possible, and if we can put all the kids in the general ed classroom, they feel more comfortable and they're included, they have peers, and they're going to learn just like the other kids. Okay? Whatever you think about it, I'm just presenting this information. Okay. Again, we have the 2030 goals that were developed during this declaration at Incheon, and they set forth goals that we as a global community have to try to achieve so that we're including more kids have access, more kids have opportunities. And so each country, Colombia has its goals and commitments that they're working on. Mexico has their goals and commitments. Every country in the world that are signatories, they signed off on this, they have a commitment to do this. Okay, and that's very important. So again, ensure inclusive and quality of education for all and promote lifelong learning. That sounds good. We're having difficulty achieving that. We have a lot of work to do. Okay? Now, UNESCO now has published policy guidelines on inclusion. So what a policy looks like in practice. What does that mean exactly? And so they've developed a pattern or what would you call it? Yeah, a hierarchy or a mechanism by which inclusion policy in each country, what it should look like and how it should function, basically. And so that's good. You know, they talk about planning, they talk about implementation, ensure that educational systems are inclusive. This is very important. So that's a part of the history of what we're looking at today. Now, there's also something, one of the co-writers or co-authors of your conference here in Cali in 2019 was somebody by the name of Mel Ainskow. He developed a tool called the Index for Inclusion. And it's really what it is. I'm trying to think of the words that he used. It's a school self-review instrument. So it's an instrument that asks questions to see how you're doing in terms of inclusive practices. It's very good. I've used it. It's in 40 languages. And basically what it does is you give it to a school and you have to analyze your educational practices. You have to analyze your policies and educational practices, and the culture of the school. La cultura, las prácticas, y las políticas of the school. And so you have those three dimensions, and each one of those dimensions has many elements that you have to look at in your school to see if you're in compliance or if you have an inclusive posture. Very good. It's excellent. It's one of the best things. It's been around for a while. I'm thinking maybe 20 years. I'm not sure. Maybe. I don't know if there's a date there. But anyway, so we have lots of tools. We have lots of policies. Unfortunately, no tenemos muchas ganas. Falta ganas. We have to, do something. I mean, it requires effort. It's wonderful. Ya está escrito muy bien. Ya tenemos la política. ¿Estamos bien? No. You have to put it into practice. La política no es suficiente. You have to put it into practice con ganas. Each country has to do that. Each country has to find the will. That's the word for ganas in English. La voluntad, the will to do it. We still have a ways to go. Okay? So let's see where we are now. Okay. So again, here's the guideline again. Guidelines for inclusive education. It's interesting because at this meeting, remember that the OECD countries are primarily countries from the global north. Mexico, I think, is included in OECD, the organization. I'm not sure if Colombia is. I don't think so. I'm not sure. But is it? Do you know? Do any of you know if it is? I don't. I unfortunately don't. But what I wanted to share with you is that what they discussed here in this meeting in 2020 at this they discussed the different ways in which kids with disabilities were being identified. And let me tell you, there's a lot of variation. Okay? Just let me read here from a document. It says, myriad differences exist in the extent to which students are both identified as having a disability and educated. So, for example, I don't know your identification procedures in Colombia, but you should have criteria that when you assess a student for a disability, you can identify them because they meet the criteria. Okay? So, national definitions of disabilities are informed about ideological assumptions about the notion of difference and vary in educational policy frameworks based upon the extent to which countries provide specific categorizations and labels. For example, in the United States, we have 13 categories of disabilities. Mexico now is non-categorical. They don't have any categories. I'm not sure what you have in Colombia. You may have audición, lenguaje, visual, sordo, mudo, lo que sea. Those are categories or definitions by which kids are labeled and by which services are provided. They may be differentiated services, okay? But let me give you some examples. Finlandia, y Suecia, they don't provide any national definition of education-related disability. So those are the two countries they don't, because they push in all the kids. They don't really think it's important to identify. Austria y Portugal have a broad definition of what special needs is or disabilities, but they don't have any categories. So there's a lot of difference in terms of what we're looking at from country to country. So that's important, okay? So let me see if we're going to move on here. Okay, this is important to recognize. What's been the impetus for all these things I just talked about? You know, Salamanca, Jomtien, Incheon, Dakar. It's all because of this Education for All push, which has been fantastic. They've really been persistent, and we can thank them that they have mobilized. ¿Cómo se llama? ¿Movilizaron? Las poblaciones, los gobiernos, la política, las prácticas. Without them, we would be nowhere. So we have to be thankful to them. So I wanted to provide this context for you as we move in now. I'm going to compare the U.S. perspective and the Mexican perspective, and it may have some relationship to what you're doing here in Colombia. I think what we discussed definitely has implications for what you're doing here in Colombia and globally. But now I wanted to move into talk about the U.S. and how it's specific in terms of how they categorize disability, unlike some countries. Mexico no longer does. I don't know if Colombia still does. Probably not, because the whole guidelines for inclusive education is that we're not going to identify kids or give them a label, una etiqueta. Aquí no sé todavía hacen eso, pero en muchos países ya dejaron eso. Pero en Estados Unidos, it continues. Okay, it continues. So this is the U.S. perspective. So this is a little bit about the evolution of inclusive education. It's not inclusive education in the United States. It's really special education. Okay? Inclusive education is a movement to us. Es un movimiento. Pero no es una ley, no es algo que pues hecho en piedra, hecho, escrito, que así es, no. En Estados Unidos tenemos our own laws and policies. But you can see the evolution of special education in the United States from the 18th and 19th centuries to the 20th century, where we had special classes in special schools, but that's involved. These are case studies. Brown versus the Board of Education. It talked about separate but equal. That's a bit, excuse me, that changed with this legislation. The civil rights movement in the United States changed everything. We move up to, here's the public law for disabilities in the United States. In 1975, empezamos en Estados Unidos, in 75. You see there, the inclusion movement. It's a movement, it's not a law. It's kind of a policy, but it's not hard and fast. And then we have what are called, how do you say reauthorizations? But for example, you have the law in 1975, you revisit the law, you make changes, and that change is in place for a while, and then you make more changes. Estamos reautorizando la política, la ley, cada 8 años. Pueden ver las fechas. In 1990, there was a reauthorization. In 1997, there was a change in the law. In 2004, there was another change in the law. Okay? It talks about different services that are provided to kids with disabilities over the years that change. And that's what that means. They have a reauthorization. For example, in Mexico, they, for example, develop a new plan of study for teachers studying special education. It's not called special, it's called inclusive education in Mexico. And so every so often, every 5 o 6 años, they change the plan of study. Why? Because the policy of the country changes. And as a result, you have to prepare teachers that are then providing instruction that's coherent with the policy of the country. Okay, so it's a lot of politica, but that affects teachers, it affects schools, it affects parents, it affects communities. So it's important. You can't deny that. Okay? So this is our law in the United States. The most recent reauthorization was in 2004, hace 20 años. No se ha cambiado nada en Estados Unidos. Ya hace falta. Ya tenemos que hacer algunos cambios. But, so this was the law that was passed in 2004, and this is the way it works still today. Okay? We have this idea of least restrictive environment. For example, what is the least restrictive environment? The general education classroom. Okay, what is after? What comes next? Maybe a special education class where kids are pulled out and they're put in a special class. Then maybe a special education school. Then maybe a hospital, more restrictive. So what I'm saying is that in our law, we look at the needs of the student, and based upon the needs of the student, we instruct them in a certain place. It doesn't have to be in the general education classroom. It can be in other environments that we design because kids need that to be able to be successful. So in most cases in the United States, though, most kids are currently educated most of the time in the general education classroom. Okay? But so we don't say, okay, automatically your special education, you go into the general ed classroom. No. We take into account the needs of the student. We also look at the team. Hay un equipo que toma la decisión of where the kid's going to be placed. The parents are also involved in determining where the student's going to be placed and where they're going to be receiving that instruction. So this is very This is very elementary, I understand, but I need you to understand that the United States, in comparison to other countries, in comparison to Mexico, in comparison to Colombia, I'm quite sure it would be the same thing. So we also develop an individual program for each student. Cada alumno tiene su plan individual de educación. They have their goals, their objectives, the materials, what they're going to be doing for 1 year. Every year, you renew the IEP to see if it's still valid. Okay? So this is a federal mandate. Un niño con una discapacidad tiene el derecho to get this IEP. And he has his own individual goals and objectives. And they'll also put there where he's going to receive the service and who's going to provide the service. Okay? So it's very explicit. We have a federal mandate, but it comes down to cada estado, each state, and they have their own Department of Education, and they can also make certain decisions about how children are served as well. So federal and state. In Mexico, no. Everything comes from the top down. In Colombia, me imagino es igual. You have a program that's developed by the federal government, and todos obedecen. Todos conforman a el plan or la política. In Estados Unidos, no. Cada estado has sovereignty to some degree, the ability to change, the ability to make a few adjustments. Okay? Let me get that. 13 disability categories. We have autism, intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, speech and language disorders, multiple disabilities. Tenemos 13 categories, each with a criteria to identify them through an assessment. In the United States, we do formal assessments, standardized assessments of the children to determine if they have a disability. No way that happens in Mexico. They don't even have standardized instruments that you can use to do that. Es mucho más subjetivo in Mexico. In Estados Unidos, no. It's very objective. You have certain criteria that you have to meet for a student to be identified. ¿Por qué? Hay dinero. Cada niño que se identifica, tiene dinero. In Mexico, no. In Chile has an interesting, there's some money attached to that in Chile, but I've never seen any other country in Latin America that has money attached to identification with a disability. It's very interesting. So that's why our system is so different and unique, and really, you can't really compare what we do with countries in Latin America. We have a very sophisticated system. Okay? There's a whole process. The least restrictive environment, kids are put in special schools, they're put in, we have a lot of options, okay? So that's important. The continuum of services. Remember I told you that some kids may be in a special school, some may be in a special class, some could be in a hospital, some could be, but in a speech therapist, terapistas de habla, we have special programs. We have programs for occupational therapy. So we have a wide range of possibilities. Again, here we talk about the federal and the state differences. Okay, what about teacher training in the United States or compared to other countries? Usually teachers in the United States can be a special education teacher after they complete 4 years of school. but the first 2 years of their program has nothing to do with their career. You've heard of the liberal arts education? That means the first 2 years, they take general subjects. And then their third and fourth year, they focus on their career in special education. Okay? In Mexico, no. 8 semestres, 8 semesters of special education, pretty much. I mean, they get some general education too, but it's very different. Now, in Mexico, they don't have a lot of master's or doctoral programs like we have in the United States. And most of the teachers who become special education teachers have had experience teaching in a general education classroom. That's very important. Why? Because a special education teacher that doesn't have any experience is less valuable and has less suggestions and has less expertise. So these are very technical things, but it's important to know the United States, you can get an undergraduate degree, a licenciatura in special education, or a maestria that permits you to teach as well. So you have those choices. Plus, in the United States, you have many specializations where you can get a PhD, a doctorate degree in the area as well. So we have 3 levels. In Mexico and most countries, it's what's called a terminal degree. What does that mean? It means you finish that and you can go and teach. You don't need any other education. With those 4 years of education in Mexico, or maybe here in Colombia, you have a program, that's all you need to be able to teach. Okay, let me just sort of talk about Mexico because you'll probably relate to this. Let me see here. Okay, so we have all these same, I mean, Mexico has adopted the same agreements that you have in Colombia because you've all signed on. And so your policy is changing everything in schools and your teacher training and everything. And so things are changing, and the policies that are coming from, United Nations, UNESCO, are good. I mean, I think they're very important. And so you look at the policy halls. I've been working in Mexico for 40 years because I went to school there, but I also been doing research in Mexico for quite a while. And prior to 1970, teachers could have basically a high school degree and teach. They could go into teaching prior to 1970. They didn't need to go to a 4-year school to get specialized teaching. Well, that changed in 1970, okay? And then you just have all kinds of changes that have happened since then. But it's gone from a very, what do I say? It's all moving towards, putting kids in the general ed classroom. It's all moving away from individual attention of the kids to more in the general ed classroom as a rule. And I'm going to show you, though, Mexico has a model which is very good. The problem is it's not well funded, and there's not enough teachers to do what need to be done. And I don't think the teachers have the appropriate training to do the kind of teaching that needs to be done with many kids. When I talked about high incidence and low incidence disability, what did I mean? Well, for example, in Mexico, I'm going to show you some statistics. Remember I said that 12 to 15% of kids in schools have a disability? The World Health Organization also made that statement. So it's just not in the US, but the World Health Organization. So in any student population, you have a certain number of students that have different kinds of disabilities. Low incidence means what? Not many kids have, autism is becoming more popular. So autism is almost like a high incidence disabilities, means it's more common in the population now than it was. But kids that are deaf or blind or have multiple disabilities or cerebral palsy, they're fewer. Those are called low incidence disabilities. What are high incidence disabilities? Social emotional, learning disabilities, speech and language. Those are high incidence, meaning they're more prevalent in the population. But who does the special education system serve primarily? Kids with low incidence disabilities. Why? They're visible. You can see them. Oh, I can see he's deaf, or I can see he's blind, or I can see he's multiply disabled, or I can see this. And so those kids are the ones that tend to get the services. But we know that kids with learning disabilities also have problems, or kids with emotional problems, or kids that have speech and language. But oftentimes we don't have services for them, although in Mexico they do have audición de lenguaje. So they try to provide training to teachers, but it's changed now. But anyway, so those are the challenges that we have. It's difficult to compare apples and oranges. And that's what I'm doing today, really, because the U.S. system is, the history is different. The policies are different. The funding is different. The laws are different. But I'm just showing you the differences. I'm trying to tell you the differences so you understand. You know what the reality is. It's very disparate from what we see in Mexico and maybe Colombia as well. So again, this is talking about how the policies changed from 1970 to 2003 with the Education for All, with Salamanca, with all that. It changed so that the law was modified in the Constitution of Mexico to talk about education, inclusive education. And it was once called educational integration, kind of like mainstreaming. Okay? But that's kind of evolved. So again, Mexico's aligned, but what you see now, their new policy is we're going to have a non-categorical approach. So all teachers are going to be prepared in inclusive education. It's a non-categorical, meaning, well, the special education teachers will have a little bit of knowledge about deaf kids, have a little bit of knowledge about blind kids, have a little bit of knowledge about kids with autism. But you know what I'm saying? It's superficial. It's not in-depth training about anything, really. That's the problem I see. Okay? But again, remember we talked about the justification? The educational justification. We talked about the social justification, but there's also an economical justification. What can you afford? What can you really do to provide for kids? Unfortunately, I mean, inclusive education on a big time thing is talking about access, giving greater access to kids. That's fantastic. And more kids are in school. But, how does that, how do you, deal with kids who are in school, but they have such individual differences that they need greater attention, and they're not getting it. Okay, it's a cruel situation. It's very cruel, francamente, very cruel. So again, the non-categorical, and so again the alignment and coherence. So if you're now changing teachers before the inclusive education, they were prepared in 4 areas, and you could choose one area. You could be an audición de lenguaje. You could be, creo que es visual deficiencies, deaf, or multiple disabilities. Now, with this policy in 2018, they did away with all those, so nobody has those specializations. What's the specialization? Inclusive education. They're all going to be in the general classroom. I'm going to be able to help them because I'm getting a little bit of information about them in my program. So let's see if we have again, this is talking about that whole movement. I have the next one. Here's actually licenciatura en inclusión educativa. See the different dimensions? We have their basic theoretical background. I have it here. I'm sorry you can't. It's a terrible, but there's just no way I could get it on a. You might be able to zoom it a little bit, but so for example, here you have basic. Let me see if I can make it bigger for myself here on my computer. So you have bases teóricos metodológicas para la enseñanza. That's the yellow. The green is formación para la enseñanza y el aprendizaje. Y la naranja, práctica profesional. So they have it broken out in different things. So every semester, kids are in schools, which is a good thing. So when they enter the first semester of 8, they're in a school. That's fantastic. Not like the United States, where they don't really get that experience until their 3rd year of college. But in Mexico, you're in the schools immediately, which is fantastic. Now, but what are you learning? What's the content? Well, up here, the first semester, el sujeto y su formación profesional. Modelos de atención que sustenten la educación especial. The third semester, educación inclusiva. I mean, so you can see what I'm saying is it's generic. It's general. You know, they're getting some, ¿cómo se llama? El tronco común, probably the part, the yellow part, is probably what teachers get, other general ed teachers when they're going through. And so the special education teachers also get that because they need it. Okay, so el tronco común para educación especial y educación general. But then you come down to the other areas here is the trayecto formativo, and you can see, for example, what is one of the courses there in blue or green? The second one, things like, see if I can read it. Pensamiento matemático. Pensamiento matemático, again. Estrategias de intervención en el aula para alumnos con aptitudes sobresalientes. Estrategias de intervención en el aula para alumnos con TEA. Trastornos, ¿cómo es? Sí, exactamente. Luego, estrategias de intervención en el aula para la inclusión educativa. Estrategias de intervención en el aula para alumnos con trastornos de aprendizaje. So they get un semestre. O sea, ¿me explico? O sea, ¿cómo es? Y luego el alumno sale, tiene un perfil y ya puede trabajar en educación inclusiva. Puede trabajar en cómo vamos a integrar, cómo vamos a trabajar con el niño en el salón de clase. But what's interesting is that this is the new model, but they have a different service delivery model which still exists, which I'm going to share with you. It's called the CAM y USAER, Centro de Atención Múltiple, en USAER, que es Unidades de Servicio en Apoyo de Educación Regular. So those two still exist and are practiced in Mexico. So we're going to go from this to the USAER and the CAM, okay? Those are the two systems by which students are served in Mexico today. CAM is for kids with more severe disabilities. So even though they've now changed to inclusive education, they still have this model where they serve kids in separate facilities. Okay? The CAM is actually a special school where they have kids with different disabilities and they provide services to them. USAER is a special education teacher who's in a school but who provides support to general education teachers. So the USAER, though, the problem with the USAER is that they have one USAER for 5 or 10 schools. They have a psychologist, a social worker, a speech and language person, a special education teacher for 10 schools primarias. Lo que pasa es cuando llega la secundaria y la prepa, olvídate, no hay servicios. Hay muy pocos servicios después de la primaria. But the CAM and the USAER, the CAM supposedly is a CAM laboral, que quiere decir they prepare them in carpintería, no sé qué otras cosas, pero algo más, un oficio, ¿no? Pero es muy pobre lo que ofrecen, francamente, en mi opinión. But that's what, so you have CAM laboral más educativo. USAER is generally, they're in the schools. So that's the model that they're using now. Again, this is all based upon, in 1993, these were developed. This came into being. But in Mexico, let me tell you the statistics. En la educación básica en México hay como, híjole, ¿cuántos millones de estudiantes hay? Hay casi 3 millones de estudiantes. Si pensamos en 12 a 15% de esta población has an identified special education or a disability, ¿qué porcentaje? How many people would that be? Figure 10% would be what? 2 millones. No, 2 millones, no. Perdón, ¿qué es 10% de 3 millones de niños? ¿Cómo? What's 10% of 3 million kids? So if you think about the number of kids that should be in special ed, this is kindergarten through 9th grade. I think I'm low on the number. I'm thinking there's more than. How many children do you have in the public schools in Colombia? You know, or more or less. It's in the millions, though. But I'm just wondering how many. Okay, but anyway, so you figure a certain percentage of kids should be in special education. What happens now? Remember that with the Salamanca in 1994, they brought up this term special educational needs. It's not only kids with disabilities, it's kids with what? Could be what? Ethnic, linguistic, women, HIV, etc. So what happens in Mexico, because of that term, they actually, at the USAER serves not only kids with supposedly disabilities, but kids with special educational needs. And so the percentage of kids that are being provided services is about, they're providing services to about 15% of the kids that need that. And there's only so many pro-CAM USAER in the school. So they have a good model, I guess you could call it, but there's not enough teachers or specialists to man all the schools. They only provide services to, I think, about 10% of the schools, 10 to 15% of the schools nationwide. So rural areas, forget it. There's nothing in rural areas. I live in a rural area of Mexico. My center, I have a center, it's called Resplandor International. We provide services to kids with disabilities who don't get services because they're from rural areas. So we provide services to them because there's no schools in where they live, where we live. So it's interesting. So, I mean, what I'm saying is this is their model. It's been in existence since 1993, though. It hasn't changed. But they aren't serving very many kids. Here's some statistics. There are currently 2,400 CAMs, 3,700 USAERs, which serve about 28,000 schools. There's the team. You have a director, a support teacher, a psychologist, communication teacher, a social worker. Okay? But, again, it says they're more segregated because students with disabilities attending school in a private or segregated classroom, and they learn alone. So, again, these are just the facts about what USAERs do, who they serve, and, the CAM. There's a lot of research about the CAMs and the fact that what they're doing is not very efficient and the results aren't very positive. So again, we're talking about a system Again, these are the statistics I was telling you about. What percent of the school-age population has an identified disability, or maybe unidentified disability? And so that's kind of a quick dance. I don't know. I don't even know what time it is. I don't know how quick it's been. I've been talking a lot. Well, it's almost 6 o'clock. Okay. So a little bit of a reflection on the Mexican system, the U.S. system, and how they compare, how they differ. You can see the differences there in terms of what's being happened. In the United States, 12 to 15% of kids in schools are in special education. And they go from low incidence disability to high incidence disability. Do you know what percent of the kids are in high incidence disability programs in the United States? Of the 100% of the kids in special education, what percent are in the area of high incidence disabilities? What percent of the 100? No, it's almost 60%. 60. What that means is learning disabilities, social, emotional, speech and language. I'm trying to think of what else comes under that category. But they're mild disabilities, mild. I don't know how you say mild. Leves. Uh-huh. In comparison to, so the smaller portion of students with severe disabilities, I mean, it's a smaller portion. It's maybe 25% of the kids in our schools have severe disabilities. And so there's a question about, well, does this kid really have a learning disability? Why is he in special ed? So we have a lot of issues about disproportionality, meaning there's a lot of Latino kids in special ed that maybe shouldn't be because it's more of a language issue than it is a learning issue. So that's what I did in my career. I tried to help teachers understand kids who really had specific learning disabilities versus kids that just had language or cultural differences. And that's a concern. But what I'm saying is that the populations that are served in Latin America and most third world countries are kids with severe disabilities, not kids with learning disabilities, speech and language. Those kids don't get any services for the most part. They're not identified because you can't tell by looking at them. As easy as that, too. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about.